Sure. Thanks, Kelly. I started my career off in supply chain about 12 years ago when ethical and social compliance were kind of becoming hot terms and topics for some of the major retailers. And a large US based sporting goods company essentially needed a young guy to pick up uh, the corporate compliance guidebook, who nobody really understood what that was, and to head over to China and just figure it out. And so started my career with them in social compliance, really understanding what social compliance is and working and training with factories to elevate their standards and compliance. And worked with that company for about 6 years, transitioning from social compliance to sourcing and eventually overseeing the entire global operation. And I started my own company, Onward Global, about 6 years ago, which is a consulting and contracting company that works with international companies, brands, and wholesalers, helping them manage, optimize, and scale their supply chains in Asia, specifically in sourcing, product development, and manufacturing.
Now it's funny, and you and I have talked before, so I know you have a sense of adventure. We'll get into it. You've lived and traveled all over the world. I don't think we've ever actually gone so far back as for me to find out how you got into this. And it's interesting because, as you said, sporting retailer looking for some young guy with a sense of adventure willing to go take care of it. Where does one post that kind of job, and how on earth did you find the listing and connect with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always tell, it's funny to say I'm old enough now, but I've been fortunate enough to always have mentors. And now I'm in a position where I'm able to mentor younger people. And I always say, applying for a job at, HR@company.com is just a very hard and
Yeah.
ineffective way of doing it. So it's all about, networking, networking, networking. And at the time out of college, I was working in a very different industry for a consulting company, engaging uh, executives all over the world. And one day I was sitting in a cubicle and I said, what am I doing sitting in a cubicle? I want to be one of these executives in Shanghai or Ho Chi Minh or New Delhi who I'm talking to every day. How can I get there? And just tapping into my network, and just meeting people. I was fortunate enough to develop this opportunity with this company.
Well, that's cool. And we're certainly going to benefit from that today. One of the things that I've always found so interesting about your experience and the things you have to share is that it's all literally from a boots on the ground perspective. We talk about global supply chain, but most of us, including me, are talking about it from the safety of a corporate office someplace, from the safety and comfort of a home office, in my case. But you are literally traveling to these places, working with people face to face, seeing things firsthand. What is something that you think people can never fully understand unless they are actually there, as you are in many cases, boots on the ground, versus trying to manage something from a distance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the supply chain has so many moving parts, and a lot of those you can actually see on the news, right? Port closures, currency
Yeah.
fluctuations, all those things a headquarter or home office can see. What's impossible to understand from home is a counterpart's culture, whether that's a supplier or a team on the other side of the world. And so Americans especially kind of see the world or business or their interactions in a very black and white, yes or no, right or wrong kind of way. But much of Asia navigates situations and interactions in a much more fluid manner, in a gray zone, if you will. And so without traveling, studying, and really knowing how this impacts day-to-day business, I think home offices can easily miscalculate both
Yeah.
risk and opportunity.
Yeah. No, and I'm sure, I mean, working for a global company gives you some sense. Like, for instance, one of my early professional experiences was on a half American, half Dutch team. And there was some cultural things we had to figure out around communication. Why was it they always got to take the entire summer off? How do you handle that, right, as a half and half team? But you do have to experience it. You can prepare for it, I think, by reading about it in a book, or like you said, staying up to date with what's in news headlines and trying to empathize and envision what it's like to be in those places. But it's almost like it's easy to say, oh, everybody's in such a rush today, or why are people all so uptight? But then you go to a supermarket or a restaurant and you have that one-on-one with somebody you've never met, you'll never meet again. And you walk away thinking, wow, that was a really nice person. It's like the collective generalization we might be operating on versus some of these individual going to a place, experiencing, meeting the people associated with the business challenges and the goals. As much as we're lucky to have the digital communications we do today, I am sure there is still a huge piece of that picture that gets left out when we're just working through screens.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny that you just kind of ended that thought with the digital, aspect, because even, a lot of people don't realize while Skype is allowed in China, Facebook and other social media platforms are not. WhatsApp, for example, is not. So a lot of people from their
Okay.
home offices or headquarters are using WhatsApp to communicate with their teams all over the world. That's not approved in China. And there's a localized version of these types of apps that the Chinese all use. And, unless someone from the head office comes over to China to really talk with their factories,
Right.
they're not going to know that. And a lot of the time when a headquarter individual comes and they learn that, they say, oh my gosh, like it'd be so great to have a tool to be able to communicate every day. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, that required you coming over here and having a dinner, with your counterpart to learn that.
Absolutely. Now, I think staying on sort of this positive theme here, we've all been through a lot over the last few years, but I feel like we can say with some level of confidence, although I feel this overwhelming urge to knock on wood, we've finally moved in sort of the post-COVID era of supply chain management. And before we start to talk a little bit about what comes next or some forward-looking ideas, I'd be interested to hear from you, again, given this global sort of boots on the ground perspective, what are some of the largest overall changes that you've seen take place?
Sure. I mean, I think there's been a huge change in people's understanding of just how complex the supply chain is, right? And what the risks are, but also how difficult it can be to change it. Certainly, many more people are talking about diversifying their supply chains out of China, or a China plus one strategy, which we're going to talk about today. It isn't easy, though. And for as many challenges that China has today, China still really remains the go-to place for many companies.
Now, when we think specifically about some of the changes that have taken place in China over the last few years that buyers would be dealing with directly, I mean, certainly you think to start with economy, I'm sure you have some observations there. But when we start to think about getting down to the factory level, looking at some of the labor trends, what are a few of the things that you've observed there?
Yeah, China's supply chain has gone through significant changes. I mean, transformative changes in the last 5 years. For executives or engineers, designers, buyers who have not been here since pre-COVID, they're going to see a completely different China.
Mm.
And some of these changes have created a lot of uncertainty and risk for foreign buyers who don't have a strong understanding or control of their supply chains. I'd say there's two really what I call macro or big changes, big picture changes taking place in China at a real factory level today. The first is the state of financial stability or instability within China's supply chain. As you mentioned, China's economy is weak today from a slowing property market, rising debt levels, consumer confidence and all that. But from a supply chain aspect, the fact that many factories have lost some of their big customers has
Yeah.
really impacted them. It's hit them hard with their revenue. And a lot of the factories who are making a small margin to begin with simply no longer exist. So it's important for buyers to understand how healthy their suppliers are, because bankruptcies are happening here every single day. And once that happens, it can be very hard, if not impossible, for a buyer to retrieve their molds, material, or any goods that they've purchased. The second macro change that's happening, which, I mean, it's just unbelievable, is the change in China's labor landscape. China's having serious challenge finding enough young people to work in their factories. And this is primarily a result from, change in demographics, but also the fact that many young people simply just don't want to work on production floors. And so this has impacted factories in three ways. Number one, workers are in very high demand. And because of that, annual wages every year continue to increase in order to hire and retain workers. Number two, while, 8-9 years ago, the average worker on a production floor was 20 years old. Today, and this is going to shock you, the average worker on a production floor doing, injection molding, sewing a bag, stitching a garment is, 50 to 60 years old.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
It's a huge jump. And so that really impacts trainability, efficiency, safety risks, and all that. The third thing really that's been impacted on the factory floor is that because it's so hard to hire workers, the size and the labor capacity of these factories have significantly shrank. And so factories are increasingly relying on subcontracting and sub-factories. And sub-factories and subcontracting can be okay if the buyer is aware of it, if the buyer approves it, if the buyer is involved in helping that primary supplier manage the quality across the sub-factories. But a lot of the time the buyers don't know, and that can really increase both ethical and quality risks.
Yeah. It's interesting. You talk about the younger people in China not wanting to go work in factories, because that's a trend. We're seeing the exact same thing here in the US. And whether it's jobs in manufacturing or whether it's even in logistics, driving trucks, it sort of doesn't align with, what will I say, like the lifestyle expectations or the generational preferences. And I think part of it, and I'd be interested to just get your general sense on this. I think a lot of it in the US is based on perceptions that are not necessarily true. There's sort of this lingering generalized idea that, to work in a factory looks like, Charles Dickens, England. It's dark, it's dirty, boot black is all over the place. Some guy in a yucky top hat's yelling at you. Whereas it's actually very clean, very automated. Most of them are well lit and nice places to work. And there's a lot of robotics, and it's not simply sort of piecework as people might expect historically. Same thing with driving trucks. There's a lot of logistics work where you go home every single night. So it's not necessarily this old school, driving cross country, not seeing your family for 2 weeks at a time. Do you have any sense more on the social side of things of what is driving that move away from young people wanting to work in factories? And is it similar to the US? Is it some combination of what the generation seems to want, perhaps as a result of maybe some of the things they experienced during COVID? Or is it simply based on old ideas about what it actually means to work in a factory?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation about the US, and it's interesting how to compare it to China. I think in China, I think it's a reality that when the average person looks at a city like Shanghai or Beijing or Ningbo and just how quickly these cities have developed. Any American, any foreigner that comes to China and spends time in one of these tier 1, tier 2 cities, they're just amazed as to how beautiful they are, how safe they are, how efficient it is to navigate. And so I think the average 20-year-old that comes from the countryside says, I'd much rather work as a janitor in a huge mall in one of these big cities where I have access to air conditioning. And yes, I'm mopping the bathroom or I'm mopping the floor, but I'm watching rich people drink their Starbucks. And that's much better than being on a production floor, right? Or, China's e-commerce, logistics, and supply chain infrastructure is incredible here. I mean, even now in tier 3, tier 4 cities throughout China, you're getting same day or 24-hour deliveries. And that's because I think a lot of the factory workers now, they would rather ride, delivery motorcycles, delivering all these
Okay.
parcels. And that's a huge opportunity. And that's a huge, infrastructural network that, China needs drivers to help deliver everything.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who was young once, I can appreciate if you're going to do something to work a job, right? And nobody's first job is exactly what they want to do for the rest of their lives. At least when your shift is over, you're in this big, fun city with lots of interesting people and stuff to do. And so, interesting. I guess that's one of those areas where, although it's a huge distance, socially and from a decision making perspective, young people are young people, and yet we're seeing the impact on manufacturing worldwide, and on the decisions that companies have to make. Now,
Yeah.
one of the other things that you said when you were talking about the city is when people travel over from the West to visit China and go to one of these tier 1 cities. It's been long enough. I feel like I've sort of lost a sense of, are there still travel restrictions in place? Are people from the West coming to visit? Have we sort of returned to pre-pandemic levels of executives traveling the world to see things firsthand, or is that maybe not quite back to where it was previously?
Yeah, travel restrictions now have all been canceled. So, anyone can apply for a business or a tourist visa and come over here from anywhere in the world. Um, with that said, I think, for better or worse, China's not seeing the same amount of people from all over the world travel, right? I think China has, again, for better or worse, their reputation has been quite hindered around the world. And a lot of people just aren't as interested in coming over here for tourism, or if they're business executives, they may just not feel as safe coming over here.
Now, certainly, there's been a lot of discussion around sourcing in China. And it's funny, if you go back and you look at, articles from 2020, 2021, there was this line in the sand. We were going to reshore everything. Jeff, that's it. Like, we're done. Everything is coming back to wherever you are. It's nearshoring and reshoring and friendshoring and all of the shorings. But the reality, when companies started to look at the individual decisions they would have to make and the plans they would have to put in place to pull that off, there are still some very real and solid advantages that China has that are not necessarily so easy to replicate or find other places. What are some of those advantages that seem to be the most lasting?
I think China by far um, remains the most competitive, diverse, and flexible supply chain in the world. And so while you have other countries such as India who may have the labor capacity, or Mexico who may have the proximity to the US, no country offers the whole package that China has. And what I mean by the whole package is expertise, network, and competitiveness. By expertise, I mean suppliers in China have become experts, both in product specializations and technical know-how, but also in understanding how to service foreign buyers. And this is a result simply of 40 plus years of foreign investment and partnerships and training. By the network, I mean both the infrastructural network as well as the supplier network. China has made huge investments in its infrastructure, allowing incredibly efficient and safe transportation, not only between factories and to ports, but also for the general population just to get around for business meetings. And they've also strategically invested in building these huge industrial zones throughout the country, where they're promoting manufacturing competition between suppliers within these zones, but they've planned them to be very rich in their diversity of resources. So
Yeah.
you often don't have to travel too far to find material, components, and assembly suppliers to build a single product. And so this infrastructure, this large supplier network, and the expertise all allow China to be very price competitive and lead time competitive. And that range of value I just outlined, is very hard to find so neatly packaged in any other country.
Yeah. And it's interesting you talk about sort of the co-location of different producers and then of course the transportation network as a whole. A few weeks ago, we did some content on art of supply around just-in-time manufacturing, which of course, and I know it's Japan, not China, but sort of based loosely on the Toyota production system. And one of the things I think it's easy to forget is we apply just-in-time to, global supply chains for the sake of retail, let's say, is that originally it was founded on a lot of those exact characteristics where you could pull off these very lean just-in-time inventory management strategies because the supplier was literally right there. So there wasn't even the uncertainty of a storm in between point A and point B. And so a lot of that co-location, I feel like I have a better sense for just how important that is to making these complex manufacturing supply chains work. Now, of course, once everybody realized, okay, not as easy as we thought it was going to be to just pull out of China and do something every place else, we went, okay, I'm going to go China plus one. So I'm going to have some of my source coming from China, but I'm going to have some other location in the world where I pull some of my supply from. Maybe over time, transitionally, we can strengthen some of the alternatives in the market. And it's been a few years that we've talked about that. So again, from your perspective of working with these global businesses, what would you say the current strength of that trend is, but even the viability as it stands today of the typical China plus one strategy?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I remember we kind of started off the conversation saying, drawing the line in the sand, like, okay, this is it. We're leaving, we're
We're
reshoring,
done.
we're diverse, we're done.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone said it, everyone started to run, and then everyone started crawling back to China.
Yeah.
So we've obviously seen in the news, right, that many companies are moving and they're doing successfully. But for as many companies that are moving, there's many, many more that simply aren't even attempting, or they're trying but are coming back. And there's a few, reality factors for that. For starters, as many countries simply don't have suppliers specializing in certain products, or they aren't experienced enough to try developing new types of products.
Yeah.
So, investment and training know-how is required to set up in another country, and that takes time and money. And so if you're a GE or a Kohler, you can invest in a new factory, you can invest in a whole team to go figure it out. But if you're a mid-sized company, you simply can't. So a lot of the mid or smaller sized companies are just having to wait for a supply chain in another country to further develop before they're able to tag along.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and this surprises many companies, but a lot of people think, okay, the labor costs in Cambodia or Bangladesh is so much cheaper than China, so naturally our product is going to be cheaper. But that is certainly not the case, because yes, labor cost is lower, but when labor cost is lower, a factory boss is able to hire a lot more workers. And when you have a lot more workers, you need a lot of management.
Yeah.
And the management that a lot of these factories in Southeast Asia are bringing in are from Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and they aren't cheap. Furthermore, in these countries, these are new factory workers. So they're not as skilled, and production efficiency is not as high as it has been in China. And the last thing to consider is that a lot of material still comes from China. So these factories have to import and ship the material from China to Southeast Asia. So all this adds up in terms of cost and lead time, which for many companies just simply isn't viable.
Yeah. Now, when companies do make the decision to even just look at alternatives to China, whether it's as part of a plus one strategy or whether they're thinking, okay, we're going to completely move, where do you find that some of the most common next step places are that they're looking to?
Sure. Yeah. So Vietnam probably has got a good head start because they became a WTO member as early as 2007. And so a lot of the Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese companies started investing there at that time, giving them a good boost ahead of Cambodia and Bangladesh in terms of their foreign direct investment and supply chain development. And they've really diversified the last few years away from apparel and footwear into everything from furniture and toys and into more sophisticated electronic component assembly. But while other and new countries now are starting to be focused on for low cost and labor intensive work, they're really starting to invest in higher end and automation based production. Cambodia has seen incredible growth the last 2 years. I think I read somewhere that just in the last 3 years, they've seen something like an 83% increase in manufacturing output.
Wow.
And a big part of that is primarily driven by large Chinese investment and relocation. A lot of Chinese companies who know business and companies are looking to diversify are proactively moving out of China into Cambodia in order to retain a piece of that pie. But I think in Cambodia today, like 80% of their exports is clothing. So a lot of apparel and garment there, but they're making big investments into furniture, lighting, electrical equipment, and things of that sort. But, people have to realize Cambodia is a very, very small country. I think they've got something like 10 million person workforce.
Yeah.
So while it can certainly be a China plus one, it's certainly not going to be a replacement.
Yeah.
And then in India, just real quick,
Sure.
I mentioned India because India is very interesting and they have a lot of big differentiations between the other countries, not only because they have a huge population, but because they've actually had a large manufacturing base for a long time because of their large domestic market. And so there's a certain level of expertise there. And they're also one of the only countries in Asia with such a diverse and developed material supply chain.
Okay.
So they've got a lot of advantages. The challenge with India is that while Vietnam and Cambodia have primarily been very export oriented in their production, India has historically been very domestic oriented.
Okay.
So having them transition from a domestic to export mindset in terms of quality and service has found, challenging for many sourcing professionals.
And I'm sure a lot of that comes down to infrastructure. I mean, China has unbelievable ports, right? Very large, very sophisticated, very accessible. If India has traditionally been more focused inward as far as production and demand goes, I'm sure a lot of that infrastructure is there, but it may not be, again, as we've been saying, at the level that China has gotten to because they simply haven't had the demand to justify investment in making them more mature.
Yeah, it's funny. My India team won't be happy with me saying this, but to to travel around China, I mean, you can because just there's the infrastructure, the train system is so great. You can in 1 or 2 days you can visit 4 or 5 factories. In India, it can take you 2 days to go visit one.
Okay.
So that just the domestic travel and infrastructural efficiency is not there yet.
Yeah. And it's headed that way, and it probably will get there, right? But for companies making decisions today, these are things that they're looking at. Now, I'm sure you've had many opportunities, whether you're working with companies or whether it's something you're observing, to see how it goes as companies try to move their production volume out of China. And of course, there's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. Although I have to add, for any Simpsons fans, I know in my house this is a standard. There are actually 3 ways to do things. There's the right way, there's the wrong way, and there's the Homer Simpson way, which is the wrong way but faster. So we're going to try not to do that. But if you think about some of the things that you've seen go well because they were done in the quote unquote right way versus things that have gone poorly because they should have been done differently, any high level observations or lessons that the rest of us can learn about if you are thinking of moving your volume out of China? These are the things to make sure you do, and here are maybe some things to avoid.
Yeah. I think a lot of companies are thinking it's going to be like the Homer Simpson way.
The right way and faster. This we've invented a fourth way.
Yeah. I think the first thing really for companies to realize is that this is not like a 6 to 12 month project, right? To relocate a supply chain or to develop a new supply chain in another country. It took us 30 years to fully understand China and optimize our operations and our supply chains here. So replicating that elsewhere, even if it's in India, an English speaking country, just is not realistic. And so for companies who really want to have success with this, they need to be fully invested in, their time, their resources, and an understanding that realistically, this is a 2, 3, 4, 5 year project to successfully do. And they need to have executive management understand this, and giving someone within the organization a clear mandate to focus on this, and that they'll be supported. Because to go at it half-heartedly, or to go at it and say, let's hope for the best, just is not enough.
Yeah. Now, we started today talking about the fact that you basically got started on this very unique career because somebody with a sense of adventure and a willingness to work hard was needed to go be in these far-flung places, to represent on the ground and be eyes for some of the business objectives that the companies were trying to achieve. And as Western companies look to change where they do production, so certainly think it's a mistake for us to not think we also need to make changes. I mean, some of it we've already started to see, even in some of the move around ESG-based decision making. So whether it's working with companies that are more ecologically minded, whether it's working with smaller or more local companies, we've seen that as you start to work with different types of firms, smaller firms especially, the line moves a little bit around what the buy side company has to do versus what you can expect your supplier to do. And I have a sense that because of some of the sophistication and maturity and investment over time, Chinese companies have actually been doing a lot of things that we're not necessarily aware they're doing to make overall engagements go well. Now, certainly there's some amount of middle ground, and that's where you come in play in that sweet spot. But there are things like infrastructure and production and material availability as we start to think about moving away from China. But in that, there's also a bit of a transition to where maybe I'm working with a less experienced or less mature account management team or customer success team that isn't going to do some of the things that, for me, maybe based on my experience, I'm going to assume the supplier is going to do. And so as we start to think about the supply chain capabilities and the sourcing capabilities that buy-side companies need to have in-house, how challenging have you seen it be for small, fast-growing Western companies that may have a small in-house supply chain team or maybe no in-house supply chain team because everything has been done through 3PLs and supply partners, to try to make some of these decisions around where to manufacture, to manage the relationships? What's sort of the corresponding investment we have to be willing to make in-house, especially if we're looking at leveraging some of these new and different opportunities we've talked about today?
Sure. Yeah, it can be really challenging because, a lot of the time headquarters have very limited knowledge as to where and how their products are being made. And this can create, large ethical and quality risks, but also the fact that, when a supplier, and this is anywhere around the world, not just China, when a supplier knows that they're working with a smaller company that maybe doesn't have the resources to come over to Asia to hold them accountable or verify what's going on, or they're working with a smaller company that doesn't have a full-time supply chain person who knows what they're talking about. A lot of the time that supplier, feels a little bit more confident, taking advantage. On the other hand, by having a team out here or by having a team, a headquarter that's able to come out to Asia periodically. This allows headquarter to have increased transparency, increased leverage over their suppliers, to both hold them accountable and negotiate better terms. And it allows headquarters to really understand what's happening on the ground so that they can proactively minimize risk and maximize opportunity. So, there's always best practices that I tell companies, especially smaller companies, as they start scaling and growing, and especially if they don't have, the resources to come over to China a few times or to Asia a few times a year. The one thing I will remind anyone that's listening here is that good quality, good customer service, good costing, good lead times, all that starts with good sourcing.
Yeah.
And it's worth investing the time and the capital up front at the beginning to identify multiple resources, to vet multiple resources, to try out multiple resources before you really, proceed with that one supplier that you may consider a partner. But, there's only one way to tell how much of a partner they're going to be, and that's through, testing and trialing.
I think that's such an excellent point. And I'm actually going to recommend anybody listening in that has internal stakeholders that tend to push back on the speed of sourcing and procurement, because that is one of those areas where we often really feel pressure to compress timeframes. The business gets impatient. Why is this taking so long? I hope people will very seriously listen to what you've said, take it to heart, think about it, and share it with the business. Because the fact of the matter is, there will always be surprises and unexpected things that happen after you pick a supplier. It does not matter which way, right, wrong, or homer you pick. There's always going to be something that you didn't see coming. But the more prep you've done up front, especially around these critical relationships, long distance relationships, I think it's a mistake to short circuit that part of the process. Certainly, we can always try to be more efficient. Digital tools make us faster, maybe not working in spreadsheets where we can avoid it. But short circuiting that pre-qualification or the evaluation or the feedback process, I am sure you have seen that balloon into enormous problems later on down the road.
Yeah. Well, I always say anyone can make a pretty PowerPoint, right? So, I can't tell you how many times I see a supplier, in any of these countries send a beautiful PowerPoint with beautiful factory photos, and wow, the material warehouse is so pretty and clean and well managed. And oh my God, they've got that many production lines. This is incredible. And oh wow, they use this kind of software to manage their systems. And then you show up and you're like, well, wait a minute, this isn't what I saw, And so I work with a lot of the time clients, new clients will come to me. They'll say, Jeff, I've been working with a supplier for a while and I'm having some quality problems or lead time problems, or I've paid them and they've kind of disappeared. Can you help me, physically go vet and verify these suppliers? And sometimes the phone call that we have after is like, hey, I don't think you even want me to tell you, where you've been producing. We got to find a plan B ASAP.
Yeah. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I always like to sort of wrap these things by looking ahead. So I'm interested, based on your experience and sort of where your work is focused right now, what is it that you're going to be watching closely as we go through this year, in terms of whether it's general decisions to move production here, there, or elsewhere, or whether it's some of those macro trends that we talked about in the beginning? What's something that you really have your eye on for 2024?
I think, like everyone, Kelly, it's November 5, 2024. Partisan politics aside, the Trump administration disrupted China-US relations and started this supply chain decoupling movement, right? And the Biden administration, for the most part, has continued to invest in that decoupling movement, although in a more behind the doors manner. But I think whether you're the COO of a US brand, a Chinese factory owner, or the Indian government. I mean, everyone is just watching November 5, 2024 to see, how is American trade policy going to change? And, if it does, what challenges or what opportunities is that going to create?
Yeah. No, I think it's actually a much more specific answer than I'm used to getting, which I love. That's fantastic. And it is interesting because you and I are actually talking in the direct shadow of Super Tuesday. And so, barring unforeseen circumstances, it does look like it is shaping up to be Trump versus Biden on November 5th. And I believe I heard somebody comment this morning that this will be the longest general election presidential campaign in history. But the good news about that is that for anybody in supply chain or operations, we now have at least the maximum lead time to start scenario planning and wargaming and looking at alternate scenarios and developing sort of parallel strategies. Because given how divided things are, there is a very good chance that it is going to be a flip of the coin at the very last minute. And so we do need to sort of be preparing for multiple paths at once. Unexpected, but fantastic answer, Jeff. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think that's a great place to wrap. Now, if people have listened in, and of course, they're going to take your advice seriously on the sourcing end of things, but if people have listened in and they want to reach out, they want to get in touch, they have questions, what is the best way for them to find you and to connect?
Sure. Well, the easiest way to learn more and get in touch is at www.onwardglobal.com or on LinkedIn, Jeffrey Goldstein, Onward Global.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you so much for being with me today to share your experience.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it.